This is number 4.
Number 4.
Number 4, and we have talked about basically free will and determinism, our definitions of God, and where we're at personally with belief, and what were the other things? Kind of different concepts of truth. And I was just re-listening to part of it the other day. I was trying to remember this. It's not empirical, but it's information that you know basically from, like, I've tried an avocado and my experience has been, so the result for me is that it's good.
Well, like pragmatism.
Well, not tautological. There's some word. Go back to number 1, and it's up here about the evidence of truth that comes from subjective experience, truth within subjective experience. We went through the different theories of truth. To me, I think it was correspondence theory to me that made the most sense, in that there's an idea of truth and it's tested within reality, rather than saying like, well, it's true because it agrees with my ideological position, or that it's useful, because just it being useful might be a manipulation of what's good for you to then say. So I think I have more of a stoic opinion or position on truth, in a sense that, like, you can't allow the benefit to you being any kind of weight in deciding what's true, because that can be very misleading emotionally. And then your result is skewed. So the thing I'm finding now is that with my idea of God, where I hold the concept of God now, at its core, the definition of God for me is both truth and love. The things we've mostly tightened the bolts down on is concepts of truth and more of these kind of empirical concepts, terms, and everything else, or more rational in a way, kind of objectified positions on these things that we can think about and struggle with. Now, the idea of the relationship or love side of that, if God is both truth and love, these are the most fundamental things within our existence, in my opinion, down to before anything existed. Those things still were there, and I would think of them as truth and relationship. So if you want to get really crazy, nothing comes into being unless there's some type of matter in some way, shape, or form that then relates to another, some form of matter. And matter is almost kind of truth, but the relationship between those is in some way relationship at a much deeper level. But when it gets to our level, this thing relationship is something that I remember from talking to you a few years ago, probably close to 10 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, right?
Wow.
About eight years ago.
Yeah, it sounds right. Probably 2016-ish.
Well, it's about right, because I was turning 40 and I'm 48 now. So,
wow. That's right. Yep.
That thing of relationship, it is the subjective part of what we're talking about that's in many ways indefinable, but absolutely central to this experience of being alive and figuring out what else there is and what we can make of this whole experience of hurtling through space on this rock. So for you, like, where do you start with relationship? Because it's kind of one of those things that you're just always in it. It's like asking a fish about water. What do you do with relationship? How do you handle it? What do you get from it? How do you place and think about it within your concept of God and how you interact with other people and everything else? What's your take on relationship?
Boy, that's a big question. I'm assuming you mean relationship
At all levels of reality.
at all levels
At
of
a
reality.
very
So my
fundamental-
relationship with this microphone.
Everything has a relationship.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think on a personal level, like conscious beings, if you will, in many ways, we were created fundamentally for that. Like, that's the reason for which we exist, is to be in relationship with, like, on a fundamental level, community and connection are what drives the human existence. So from God to us. So we like it's a necessity. It's not an option. It is fundamental to our core. Like we need water, we need food, we need shelter.
Yeah.
We need oxygen. We need
People that fall out of relationship don't do well. And when relationships break, it's extremely painful. When they're good, you can feel like everything in the universe is just exactly where it needs to be.
Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say we are fundamentally relational creatures. We cannot exist outside of relationship.
I mean, you can Ted Kaczynski it, I mean.
Well, I mean, he still had relation to other people.
Right, but I mean, as on the
to your point,
slider scale, he went.
But to your point, his existence was very atrophied and not healthy, right?
Yeah.
So the
scary thing is he wasn't that inaccurate though in his predictions. If you this has come up recently, a lot of people have read his manifesto and been like, "Oh, we're living exactly what he said."
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he was part of the Harvard LSD studies and stuff.
He was.
I think
Wasn't he a Harvard grad or something?
Yeah, and he was part of LSD studies there. I think you'd have to Google it.
Well, that explains a lot. Yeah. But I mean, to your point, look at his health, if you will, mentally. I mean, we do know, scientifically. Again, I'm not a scientist. Caveat, but scientifically, if babies aren't in relationship with other humans, then they'll literally die. There's been experiments done along those lines. So,
I wonder which nation at which time of society tested that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's been done a few times.
Oh, geez.
But, once we get Ted Kaczynski's age, you can try to remove yourself from society. You won't die right away because you probably have enough in the tank, so to speak.
Yeah, right.
That could get you for a little while. We need that to be a part of our regular diet in order to be a healthy, functional person.
So here's something that I've realized. I don't know if I talked with you about this or not, but the thing I've had I've realized that can help me pin down why church communities are so uncomfortable for me. In that relationships are extremely important to me, or they affect me to a very, very intense degree. And if I'm interacting with a group, it's in many ways, it's why I have fewer relationships. The relationships that I have are of a, how would you say it? They're more of a fire hose than a garden hose, and you can only take so much water. And so it's, and to be in relationship with someone who's not of that same disposition, that likes more of a group dynamic rather than a one-on-one, can make that person feel like you're suffocating them too.
So you're saying you're more of the one-on-one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And the people who like the big
community, many people to interact with. It's more like garden hose between me and you, garden hose between me and you. I'm fire hose to one person.
Gotcha.
And that can, if you're not that type of person, that can be a little I can't drink from the fire hose. So, but for me then to be in relationship to relationship that way means a massive amount to me that I'm very sensitive about. And so then I interact with a group that I don't know these people initially. And the only reason I'm starting to relate to these people is that we all agree to some degree on an ideological position. Now, to put ahead of the importance of relationship, more so the importance of agreeing on an ideological position about what's beyond what we can prove, and then say that's the filter for the people that you'll associate with. I think that's messed up. I don't appreciate that. Now, this is also why I say in my introduction of you in chapter 1 of this or whatever, the first episode, is that you haven't chosen to move your focus of relationships outside of your community. And by community, I mean Bangor, Maine, New England. Like you've stayed where your relationships have grown and been. It's not like you've sold the relationships to gain other things in a sense. That's what it feels like to me if I were to do that. So to associate with a church body that then you become in relationship with, but then if you disagree with them too much, that relationship is broken. To me, that's not the, those are not the pins that hold relationships together for me. The relationship is still meant to be held together, even if we see things ideologically different. So if I associate with a church that's too rigid, then you're out. And that, to me, that's why I feel like church feels like belief under duress. And that is not good.
Well, I think that's at the core of like all unhealthy religious communities is shame, which Brene Brown, are you Brene Brown fan?
I don't know about fan, but I
you've
know
heard,
about
and yeah. So she defines shame as like the fear of disconnection. So religious communities will use shame as a source of conformity because they threaten disconnection. And I would say that's at the core of all, to some degree, on some level, all groups on some level, because I don't know that there's a perfect community in the world.
Yeah.
And so we utilize shame as a source of conformity, which the reason we do that is a whole probably other story and episode. But that's why I think you feel uncomfortable. It's why I feel uncomfortable. But this is, I think, at the core of the human. And part of it, I think, is because, you know, we are not secure enough in ourselves. So we have to get other people to get on the same page as us to help us feel better about our own convictions.
That's why yeah, okay. So,
And I would say that what those types of communities are doing, like those church communities, they are prioritizing truth over relationship because relationship makes them feel too uncomfortable. It makes them too, it makes them feel too unsecure. Like they feel vulnerable, and in order to escape those feelings of vulnerability, they have to just put their feet down on the solid rock of truth, so to speak. Does that make sense?
More than making sense, I know what you're talking about from experience. And the thing I've come to realize is that the personality disposition of being open accepts truth from experience much more so than truth from being told it's true, right? And when you say something like that, were I conscientious, I would probably more so be like, all right, this is good information. I'll store it and I'll remember it. And when I run into the situation, I'd be like, oh, I remember Shawn told me about this. I'll pull this information off the shelf. And that's just not how my mind works. I have very little like real memory compared to people I know that have insane memory. Just they can recall every single thing. But if you ask them to come up with an idea, it's a dead blank closet.
Yeah.
What is that about? Like that
Yeah, I mean,
different trajectory. But
no, I mean this is all related and it's all kind of woven together. I you know, we could be armchair psychologists here, I suppose, if we wanted to.
Am. Just enough to get myself in trouble.
As am I. I mean, I don't want to claim that everybody is acting out of their trauma, but I think a few years ago I realized that when I'm arguing with somebody, quote unquote, I'm not really arguing with their arguments. I'm arguing with their trauma. And as I said, because when we challenge somebody intellectually, a lot of times we're really challenging their sense of security.
Well, you're questioning the survey of their boundaries of their land.
Yeah.
It's like, well, I think that pin might be in the wrong place.
Yeah. But
And-
again, that gives them security.
Yeah, and so the response is like, whoa, why are you taking a swing at my crutches?
They feel threatened, and they're thinking, man, this is like I had all this other turmoil and upheaval in my life, but at least I can stand on the solid ground of certainty, And so when you come in and you start to push back a little bit, you are undermining their sense of security.
Right.
And a lot of that times is that security can be pursued because they didn't feel secure relationally. Now, I wouldn't say it's always the case, but on many levels we all suffered trauma. I would submit that like sin, quote unquote, as we call it, in religious circles, is basically trauma. Like we are inflicting trauma upon other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody's experienced it. And the question is, what do we do with it?
Right.
And I would say many highly conscientious people, to your point, instead of confronting it and dealing with it and processing it, they cling to an unhealthy form of religious experience.
Or at least one that they're extremely hesitant to update.
Yeah.
That's what I've found is the issue that...
because it would undermine their sense of security.
Yeah. And one, they might be right in some instances that it shouldn't change. They may be 100% right.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to accept that their lot, and this is where I start to see individuals as either prophets or priests in a biblical sense.
Mm-hmm.
A prophet is usually going to be of a more artistic disposition and a little more separated from society. Think of the stereotype, how they dress, how their hair might be, and how they might come in from the mountains and say things to the community because they have a relative perspective on being outside of that, that they can actually see what's going on. And a lot of times the prophets are ones calling people back to more conscientious behavior, oddly enough, even though they're not of that disposition. The difference between priest and prophet, like a priest is going to maintain traditions, maintain order, consistency, all that. That's the conscientious burden that they cannot get out from under. And if you try and get them out from under that, they're going to feel like they're not doing what they're supposed to do. In the same way that if I interact, I think I'm an extreme example, but if I interact with a church that's overly conscientious, I feel like I have no use because I'm constantly looking outside of what we know with tons of ideas and tons of questions. And then I turn that back to the people that I care about to say, here's what I can do of value. And it's like, get the spears out. This guy's threatening again. It's like, there's no use for me here in this kind of thing. Now, overwhelmingly, my criticism would be that Adventism is like that, overly conscientious. Now, this is just a personal position, and it is not accurate. It's accurate from my emotional position. That's all. And to be fair, we are in New England.
I was going to say that. You and I we spent the majority of our adult lives in a very, very conscientious region of Adventism.
Yeah, and in just general disposition, New England is a little more traditional. Maybe not conservative, but traditional. And far more atheistic than the rest of the country. And it's alarming to me to see how much more open-minded to like, I was, sitting in the flowers the other day and, the spirit spoke to me in California. Like everyone is far more like, well, what do you think? And maybe it could be this. Yeah. And in New England, it was like, there's nothing. There's nothing. Get over it, So there's this weird kind of juxtaposition of the burnt
Yeah.
over district and what's left, but then the people who are here, who are still into it, are the ones that you never would have burnt out anyway. So maybe this is where the 144,000 do come from in the last days. Who knows? So I
There you
wrapped
go.
that right. But yeah, so the priest and the prophet, you have to have both, and they have to be working together. Also, it's going to be pretty bad. But the problem is that, especially with religion and churches, they tend over time more conscientious, it seems, like to a fault, you know?
So I was going to say, I was listening to our last episode while I was driving here, and my drive is not as long as it used to be because I just moved to Portland, so I only got about
Put
30
it on
minutes done.
2X.
Yeah. But there was a part that I was like, you know, when you're listening to yourself, you're like, just say this. Say this. Why didn't you say this? And I'm like, why didn't I just say that? We were talking about love versus free will, and you were saying free will is the most like fundamental principle or something like that.
I think free will is
the
love
most-
in a sense.
Yeah. So that's what I was arguing. I was saying, well, I don't think you can separate the two. And you're saying, well, only love could exist with when humans existed or whatever. And what I wanted to say was, on a fundamental level, I believe that there is, prior to human existence, a triune God. And that triune God is defined.
Let's define triune real quick.
Good. Yes. Thank you. Triune, 3, unity, 1. So
Okay.
3.
Father, Son,
Son,
Holy
and
Ghost.
Holy Spirit. Yeah. That's obviously a very fundamental axiomatic idea among Orthodox Christians. And I would consider myself an Orthodox Christian, little o.
Little
not
o.
Big O. Well, because Orthodox is an actual branch of
Yep.
Christianity split off from the Roman Catholic tradition 1,000 years ago. So I'm a little o Orthodox Christian. This idea of a triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit.
Sounds like a good T-shirt.
Oh, okay.
I'm a little low.
So the belief that there is this triune God that has existed for all eternity prior to any other creature, thing, object in the universe. And within this triune God is this fundamental experience of love.
Okay.
And so relationship is even fundamental to God's existence. Father, Son, and Spirit. So like that is the core of the universal existence is relationship, Father, Son, and Spirit. And it is out of that, relational existence or experience that we were brought into existence. And we were brought into existence. And this is a part that was so helpful for me a few years ago. So I try not to go on a rant too much, but if God is love, then God fundamentally must be a plurality of being, plurality of persons, because love necessarily needs more than one person in order to be
I get what
operative.
you're saying, but obviously I'm, well, not obviously, but I don't know that I completely agree with you yet, but
Okay.
could
All right.
potentially
All right.
get there. I fundamentally, I think that this idea of, first of all, God and Christ, I can view God as being far more of the nature of love, not in that I'm a nice guy and I'll treat you nice, but the fundamental character being something separate from truth, but a thing that stands alone, but also needing to be,
So, but again, we keep coming back to the question: what is love? What do you mean by God? Is
So the way I understand these things and have to think about them is like all the way down to there's God. I can go back to that point, and I can say I'm a deist at this point.
Yeah. Breaking news. Breaking news.
Hot off the press. And I'd like to do that in an episode eventually, to actually try and lay out without you knowing ahead of time. I'll just surprise you with my
Sure.
to lay out like, all right, here's where I'm at, and here's what I'm thinking, and I've done it in a layers of slides, so it overlays from God to then truth and love, and then how it expands into reality. And I need some I need some bones to that structure a little bit more so. But what was your question? That I was trying-
God being love,
right.
Deism.
So
You're saying
to understand, I can
God
go
in
back
Christ.
now to a dot in my thinking that's like, okay, God. All right. I see enough evidence in our current reality that, to me, if we look at the trajectory of how facts come into being, I know this is a weird thing. That's how I have to think about it. Fact is made up of, at minimum, two other facts in relation.
Okay.
Okay. So the fact that we're doing a podcast at minimum is like, you're a person, I'm a person. And, you know, there's
people
minimum,
listening and watching.
This is a gobzillion billion amount of facts that make it so we can do this. But if you keep going down, at the smallest thing, two facts in relation that are consistent. You can map that and say every time these two things are in relationship, this fact arises of chlorine happens or whatever. So that's like the most basic thing. But those two facts being truth, essentially, like the encapsulation of truth as a fact, it's only true, it's only important, it's only valuable in that just absolutely nanometer of, space. It's just that fact. And it's not a truth that is widespread. It is a fact. It's okay. So two facts, then when they relate, that idea of relationship can create another fact. So that process goes from, as I look back towards God, I have to untangle facts at each instance to work my way back. Okay. Now, as I work my way back, everything tangles down or pulls apart into both truth and love, essentially, as my thinking goes back to, there's nothing else to untangle other than truth and love, truth and love, truth and love. So those facts, if you go back a million steps in reality, you go from our reality to, molecular, chemical, nuclear, you get deeper and deeper into physics and whatever else. At the very base, you've got truth and love. In our existence, we experience those things as a growth out of those core things. And in the beginning, God created both male and female. This is where it steps into our reality, this truth of their nature. Now, God went from being a perfect relationship of truth and love to bifurcating God's self into male and female in creation in us. And between those two kind of, in a sense, facts of God that can be, but they're still, they have to be together in relationship in a sense.
Well, I would say, of course, going back to what I was saying earlier, that God already fundamentally was bifurcated or even trifurcated. Because, and the question was, how can God, in order to be love, must necessarily be a relational, communal, plural existence.
Right.
Because love, how does love exist unless there are necessarily things that are relating to one another? So if God was a single solitary self in existence prior to, and we can't, the language prior to implies time, but prior to time, God could not be love, seemingly. So
Time's another one that's a deep one. But
so all I'm saying is that God's fundamental reality is relationship. And the reason I bring that up is because in truth. Sure. Yeah.
So that's where the conscientious come in and say, yeah, but.
Yeah. But the reason I was bringing that up is because it was if God was a single solitary self and needed and was defined by love, he would then have to have other persons to exist with him.
A bit of a leap.
Okay. What's that?
A bit of a leap.
Bit of
persons. I mean, what's beyond our existence that can reach into our existence to critique your belief system cannot be encapsulated in the idea of personhood. So what do you mean by personhood? Personhood as we can empirically encapsulate
I'm not
it.
saying human beings.
Okay.
I'm saying
So you're not Mormon.
I'm not Mormon. No. Although my neighbor the other day, when I met her, she goes, "Oh," when I told her I was a Seventh-day Adventist, "Oh, are those the ones in Utah?" I said,
There's some in Utah.
"There are some." I don't think those are the ones she was saying.
Really good people, though, by
Yeah.
the way.
Oh,
and
yeah.
man,
Nothing
they have a
against-
good system.
Yeah.
Like if I were window shopping for religions, I would be Mormon.
Wow.
I mean, they've
So-
got it together.
It
But I'm not joining a religion anymore. So
it will not be a coincidence when they show up on your doorstep after this episode is released.
we heard.
No, wonderful people. Absolutely. I have some really, really good Mormon friends. What was I saying? So the point is that I'm not saying human beings. I'm just saying in order to be loved, there has to be an object to love, right? So God, because love,
Yeah.
again, my understanding of love is that it's the giving of oneself to another. Minimal definition. That's whatever. So
Within reality as we experience it, that's how we most often hold,
Yeah.
interact, and share and give this concept of love.
But how can love exist? I mean, what does it even mean if it's just like, if I'm just, in theory, if I'm off in the middle of the woods by myself for my whole life, like, am I truly, and I don't talk to anybody, I don't email anybody, I don't know anybody, I'm just there. Is love going on?
That sounds like the tradition of a monastic life.
Well, but there's still some relational interaction.
Yeah. I mean,
In a
people could
monastic
climb up and ask you questions.
Yes, and there's other monks.
And there's other, maybe.
Yeah. So anyway, the point is, and you know, this there's a lot of presuppositions in this argument, I admit, but love, as I understand it, in order to exist, needs others to exist with it.
It needs at minimum one other
Yeah.
to be able to happen,
My point is,
which is kind of like facts.
so my point is, since I understand God to be fundamentally defined as love, and that
Now, why not
means-
truth as well?
Yeah, I would say truth is an expression of love. That's what I would say. Now I know you make a distinction between the two, but I would just say truth is an expression of love.
Okay, wait,
So-
let's sit with that for a second.
Okay.
Truth is an expression. Oh, here we go.
I just don't want to lose my train of thought. But
Okay, go on.
no.
I'll
So-
write that down.
So this is the point I'm trying to make. It's all coming back to what we were originally talking about. Yes, write it down on your nice sheet of paper, graph paper, not line paper, graph paper, because you're
I'm going to use
an
a really
architect.
ugly heart there.
There you go. God, because God has all God needs within God in order to be love, right? Because there's at least two.
Didn't have all he needed to meet his desires, its desires.
I would say it.
Had the desire to
Did.
create.
Okay.
Was not fully content. That's a fair critique.
Maybe. We'll come back to that. Write it down. Because God had all God needed within God's self, God created humanity and created me. And let's not get tripped up in what I mean when he said he created me. But God brought me into existence, not because God needed me, but because God wanted me. He had the desire for me to exist.
Yeah.
So there's nothing I can do that somehow fills or it addresses a problem in God's existence.
Say that again.
So there's nothing I do that somehow addresses or solves a problem that God has.
We're justifying the character of God.
So,
Right?
I mean, but that's what God then did as a result of bringing me into existence.
Okay, all right. Now, okay, so what was this last thing you're saying? Because in many ways, our purpose, as I've been told from my history in Adventism, is to justify the character of God.
Yeah.
Which means that someone's raising an accusation.
Sure.
That we're here to prove, no, this is the better way. Which then goes back to, well, why did God create us if God was perfectly content? If you're perfectly content, you're not going to do a single thing. Now, if you're perfectly content, but get fulfillment from something, but creativity, in a sense.
Creativity, I would distinguish though from necessity, right? By definition, creativity is just something one does out of pure
creativity is
choice, not out of necessity. I mean, human beings. I guess you could argue, human beings, like creative people, feel like they need to express themselves creatively.
I think creativity is like interacting with other humans, though. If you don't do it, you're going to crumble. It's going to be very, very bad if you're a creative type. And I find this to be very, very consistent. Like this whole thing here, this little camera, is because I need to continue to work creatively. Now, my job, I get paid to work creatively, but I've done it so much that it's not really an act of creation anymore. It's more, I've figured out this problem of subjectivity and aesthetic creation, and I 100% know how to do it now. And I can do it well, and I can do it every time. There's not the same emotional return on creativity that there used to be in my work because I'm so good at it. Now that means I can charge more. But getting money was not the very first reason why I got into this. It was like, I enjoy this. Maybe I could make money at it. Then when you turn it into that thing that you prostitute, it becomes something different. You can charge a lot for it. People want it. Great. But it's part of yourself that's taken when that aspect of creativity. It's a weird, sensitive thing. And I'm sure you can feel that in pastoring, that there's a lot of emotional depth that has to go into a sermon and interacting with people that takes something from you, far more so than if you were just faced with the boredom of sanding rubber to a tolerance every day, standing in mat. That has its own difficulty. I get it. But there's definitely a loss of something through creativity as well.
Well, I think admittedly there are limits, and maybe this is a get out of jail free card. There are limits with the analogies we use for ourselves and God. Like we cannot just transfer all of human experience and existence and thinking onto God and say, well, because I feel this way or do this thing, that means God does it this way as well. Like because I need to eat food in order to exist, then God must need to eat food in order to exist type thing.
Right.
Like, yeah, God is creative, but does that mean that God needs to create in order to be, in existence? I would say God is just by definition creative. So if you take away I don't know, can you take, this gets into questions of divine simplicity. I won't go down that road too much because
sounds like a fun one for me to get distracted with.
I wouldn't say that I'm a terribly expert in that topic, but it's basically like God, all of God's attributes are one and they're like all the same, so to speak. So like you can't take any away without like basically taking God away.
House cards.
Anyway,
sense.
Yeah. So
can I run to the bathroom really quick?
Yes, please.
All right.
Do.
Now, wait, where are you at right now?
God created me because He wants me, not because He needs me. That was the point I was trying to make.
And I kind of push back
you
against
push back,
that.
and I appreciate that.
Okay, want versus need.
Want versus need.
So can God have... Okay, so after this, I have to try and define... It's hard to define relationship because relationship is birthed out of what you would call love.
Mm-hmm.
The feminine is birthed out of that in my thinking. And that is the aspect that is more present in those who are creative or more sensitive or more relationally oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And it's far more subjective than objective. And that that nature is so much harder to define.
Mm-hmm.
It resists being objectified. This is why we don't hear about, in my opinion, this is why we don't hear about men complaining about being objectified.
Mm-hmm.
You objectify a man, he's like, really? Well, thank you. I've worked very hard at that. You objectify a woman, and we know immediately, boop, don't, let's steer away from that. That is not appreciated from them. And I understand it because my nature is far more feminine than masculine as far as my psychological disposition. I don't want boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be free. I want to be able to wander and experience subjectively so I can have more to pull from to create. So that's kind of a base nature of relationship.
So the reason I was bringing this up is want versus need is for me, it was a turning point because I realized that if God is not, now I'm going to go back to your question about the Adventist thing that you and I are familiar with about doesn't God need us to vindicate,
justify character?
But for me, it was a turning point because if God created me because He wants me, it means that his attitude towards me is not dependent on whether I perform the thing that He needs me to do.
Right. So if your parents are farmers and they had you because they needed more kids on the farm, it's a different, really? Compared to we just wanted kids because
we wanted kids, we wanted to relate to them, we wanted to love
relationship.
them, we wanted to be with them.
Right.
And so it's not conditional upon me performing, right? So that was pivotal in my thinking. Now, admittedly, I understand that there is a sense in which there is something God wants me to do, right? And even apart from Adventism, there's many people, Christians who, or even Jewish people, like Tikkun Olam, which is like human beings were created to complete the work of God in this world.
I could get behind that. But.
So there's a sense in which I understand that, but what does that mean? Does that mean that, again, his acceptance of me is based on my ability to perform the task He has for me?
Right.
So I'm not trying to remove any responsibility. There is a sense in which we have the opportunity, privilege, responsibility to be good stewards of the world on a fundamental level. Or if you are from the Adventist perspective, there's a sense in which, we're here to complete the work of God in this world and reflect His character of love so that people understand who God is.
Right.
Sure.
Right.
But my acceptance with God is not based upon my ability to perform that task. So I don't know. That's a whole jumbled mess because I'm talking about the want versus need thing. But maybe my task is simply to live out and embody the reality of God's relational love for me.
It's a hard thing to really, it's a hard thing to objectify a clear understanding on it because of how I see everything now, very, very much open and conscientious. Every aspect of my life, I can see, I'm more this way there, and I'm more this way here. And I see the two interacting, and I can tell, this part of my nature is more this way, more conscientious maybe. And if I hammer down on that, the people on the receiving end of that, I can see how it affects them. And then on the other side of this, if I act in a more open way, I can see how it affects them. And there's definitely very negative aspects of ways I can affect people by being too open or too conscientious. And there's positive ways, you know. And what that tells me is that they just have to be tied together more closely. And it's when they become disentangled that things get really weird. You know, it's when you know, half of a church wants to be really open and, you know, maybe play a djembe up front or something. Or what's this box thing now that sounds like it's got beans in it and you sit on the
which is a funny name.
It's a horrible name for something that you sit on and slap between your legs. Don't take it to Spanish church. Yeah. So yeah, I've heard that these cajones can really break up churches. But when that happens, you get one flock that's kind of maybe, well, we're just gonna wander, and then the other one's like, we will do it all on the time, and you know, and it's like, what are you guys doing?
Not to be reductionistic, but again, I would say a lot of that stems from the stress of thinking that God needs us to do something, and our standing with God is determined by the degree to which we perform
those tasks that he needs us to do. Yeah. Now, what's the correct way of thinking that? Like you just outlined for me, like, all right, you can go wrong by thinking this way. What's the correct way of thinking about that, in your opinion?
In my opinion, the correct way to think about it, or a more healthy way to think about it, put it that way, is so the human psyche, I think, at the core longs for the I want to say feeling, but the assurance of connection, right? Because we, I would say we're relational creatures. So I think there does have to be a way to both understand the invitation to creative, healthy, productive work, while recognizing that our ability to perform that work does not determine the degree to which God is willing to stay connected with us.
So it's like if you have a volunteer organization and people you're looking to improve an area and people come, you know, some people may be 85 and not able to paint overhead, but it doesn't affect, like, you being 85 can still, why don't you tell the children's story for the kids here that aren't working, for the parents that are working? You still serve a purpose, and just because you can't do that, you can do this.
And even if you do the thing and you don't do it perfectly, we're not going to kick
volunteers
you out. Yeah, we're not going to kick you out, right? We're not going to say, look over everyone's shoulder and say, oh man, you didn't do that exactly as it was supposed to be done. Maybe the greatest thing we can, I actually preached a sermon a few weeks ago, and you want to go on Facebook, Freeport Church 7, a little plug there. I don't remember when it was.
You just should call it Fulcrum.
I didn't come up with the Freeport Church 7 thing. That was prior to I'm not trying to throw anyone under the bus, but maybe the greatest thing we can bring to the task is our inability, our weakness, our broken, vulnerable selves.
There's a very deep understanding of that I ran into that made me cry. But it's in those moments of really understanding your brokenness that you become the most useful. Like you actually get out of the way.
Yeah.
So the soccer mom that's still very concerned, or the soccer dad, whoever, that's so concerned about their position in society and everything else, compared to the heroin addict. The heroin addict will go stand on the corner and beg for money to get with it. There's no lie there. And there's something about that is much more fertile soil for something to grow in someone who's trying to keep up appearances.
Absolutely. And so that's what I would say is that God, because he's relational, can I use he?
But that's fine.
Gives us the space and the freedom to not be perfect. And that is the necessary conditions for us to grow and mature. Like the same thing with our children, right? Like if we shamed them every time they fell when they were learning to walk, they would never learn to walk. And so they have to be able to be imperfect, make mistakes in order to grow in their abilities. So maybe, again, the task before us is not necessarily our ability to perform something perfectly, but to just bring our weak, broken, vulnerable, imperfect selves. And we need to create the space to allow people to be imperfect, which I think, again, really undermines a lot of religious communities, because a lot of religious communities believe that the goal is to perform perfectly. And so that undermines the whole project. It's counterintuitive, really, in many ways, because it's the imperfectness that allows us to grow into the maturity of the task at hand anyway. So my point is, as you asked the question, like how would I articulate it? Yes, God invites us into a work of grace, of love, of redemption, of healing, of whatever. But he doesn't place conditions on our ability to perform it. And in fact, our inability is what qualifies us in many ways. So there's this passage, one of my favorite passages in Scripture, the Apostle Paul, he basically says, when I am weak, then I'm strong. I will boast in my infirmities. I will boast in my imperfections, because God's strength is made perfect in weakness. So we
just don't get that.
No.
Not in the least, because it's so hard it's so much easier to have a playbook and make sure that everyone stays in line. And staying in line is safer. So you have the justification to say, guys, no, that we've already determined, like, you need to get on track here. And if you don't, we're going to figure out ways to get you on track. Yeah. And then we'll have systems of it.
Well, again, because we were shamed when we messed up. And so when that's our experience, then we have to offload that to other things. So when I was shamed repeatedly as a child for not measuring up, I build that shame up, and then when I get older, I have to, like, in order for me to avoid the feelings of shame myself, I have to blame somebody else. And, going back to that first story, Adam and Eve, we talked about it in our last episode, the 30 minutes I remembered to listen to. That was the blame game immediately from the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Adam blamed Eve blamed the snake, on and on it goes. It's just a blame game. So shame expresses itself in, I guess you could say, aggression towards other people.
Or an ability to offload responsibility in a sense. Yeah. Like, well, how do you... So when someone does negative behavior, unhealthy behavior, how do you adjust that behavior by not shaming, but do it in a not progressive, but in a beneficial manner? To like, all right, we're not going to shame you, but we're going to let you know this was the wrong way to do it. Don't get the shame here, but this was not the healthiest. Like, how do you do that?
Well, it depends, on the relational context, right? Are we talking about as a parent? Are we talking about as a spouse?
For me, primarily as a parent, because that's where my biggest concern is. That's probably why I'm thinking that.
I would say, this is a huge question, a parenting question. There's a lot of psychologists would make a distinction between you did bad versus you are bad. right? Like,
Yeah.
so we can correct behavior in a way that ideally, in theory, doesn't lead to the message that you are therefore bad because you did this.
Mm-hmm.
This is simply saying this particular behavior was inappropriate or unhealthy or dysfunctional. You know, those are maybe terms that a 10-year-old may not understand exactly, but sharing them in a way that hopefully communicates that just because you did this wrong doesn't mean that you yourself are fundamentally worthless, no good, you know, of no value, or, you know, defective in some way. Also learning to express oneself in more I statements than you statements.
Mm-hmm.
So stepping back and just on a larger relational context, like there our natural disposition, because of the way that we've experienced our own trauma and so forth, is to project onto other people their behavior and say you ... instead of saying I. So example, like if my wife does something that I'm uncomfortable with, I might say something like, you never do this or whatever. Instead, turning around and saying, I feel uncomfortable when you do this.
See, my problem is I realized that a while ago that you can't challenge people's feelings. And being a good manipulator, you know, they can have its uses.
Yeah.
But, you know, it almost feels manipulative to use my feelings as a way of, but
it's,
yeah.
but I mean, there's a lot of truth to it, because what you're doing is you're naming your own reality, rather than projecting to them.
Rather than trying to objectify their character into something that you think you see. You're making an assumption on their character, rather than you might have chosen this knowing it was the wrong thing. And we all do that sometimes. And then it's not okay, but it's okay. And also, you might not have known you're doing the wrong thing here too. So
and you might say this with your, not even, I use an example with one spouse, but with your children. You know, let's say you're driving in the car and they're just screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming. I know this never happens.
No.
Instead of saying, you guys are so loud and like obnoxious or whatever, instead saying, man, I feel really stressed out when you guys are screaming this much, right? So you are merely naming your own reality,
Right.
and you're not making a moral judgment on it. You're just saying, this is the way.
Yeah, and that allows them to place themselves in that situation as, oh, I can choose not to be the one who's creating discomfort for people. Okay, maybe I'll choose that, rather than you are uncomfortable to be around.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the reason, a lot of times, the reason we don't do this way is because it's too vulnerable. Because it's easier to attack.
Vulnerability, though, is so powerful.
Yeah.
Because it's not using power, it's awakening empathy in someone else. And it is the least offensive way to interact with someone to help convince them of something that might be true from your perspective. And if you can do it that way, it's a much better end result. But if you're really skilled at it, you can really start a cult, maybe. So
it's true. It's a double-edged sword, really. And the reason I'm, you know, what I mean by this, well, what I was going to say is, like setting boundaries, relational boundaries is, I think, a healthy way of approaching things. Ultimately, when somebody is acting in unhealthy ways, it's because it's unhealthy to other people, right? So that's why behaviors that are needing correction are needing correction. Not Now, sometimes as a parent, it's because I'm just annoyed, and that's a me problem, right?
Yeah.
So, so unhealthy relationships, behaviors are unhealthy because of the way they negatively affect other people. And so setting boundaries for somebody is appropriate so long as we're, again, communicating that they're not defective as a person because of their behaviors. Because maybe they just don't know, right? Maybe it's not because they're trying to be like, sometimes it's really easy as a parent to assume that my child is just trying to annoy me. Like that's just what they're trying to do.
Whenever my kids start to become directed and annoying at me, I know they just want my attention. And I'm like, I just turn to them like, you need attention, don't you? And they're like,
I guess.
yeah, I do. It's like, all right, come here.
Yeah, exactly. So they're not trying to be annoying, to just annoy.
Well, sometimes they are trying to be annoying, but
but the reason
the reason is I
they
want
want
your
connection.
attention. Yeah,
They want connection.
Yeah.
Or they want to feel purpose, meaning, right? Maybe they're bored.
which should I should recognize that.
Yeah.
I should be the mature, old enough, least ego enough person to be like,
In theory, right?
Yeah.
That's why we're the adults.
Yeah.
Now again, just because they
Recently.
just because they want attention or connection doesn't mean they always need to have it, but not giving it must be born not simply out of frustration, but because there's other legitimate needs that I need to address. So I don't know.
This is all about relationship.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing to me is that everything else we've talked about is a little bit more easily defined because relationship, again, is of the feminine nature of love, which is just so much harder to define.
Just to clarify again, I have not necessarily subscribed to the gendered categorization of
You might
all.
eventually.
I might eventually. I'll reach enlightenment.
The funny thing I find,
Yeah.
conscientious people have hot button topics. You have hot button topics.
Me? Yeah.
But they're in the more open disposition of like when it gets into gender or sexual preferences and stuff.
Yeah.
I never really realized that as an more open person, where your hot button, and I don't mean you, like I'm the same way, that I'm like, oh, wait, yeah, I've got things that I'll be like, now to be clear, you know, like this, it's like, oh, okay.
If I were to psychoanalyze myself, it would probably be because I don't want to offend the groups of people that I covet.
Yeah. I remember
Acceptance
hearing
from.
a story, let's see, some it's probably just a made up story, but the experience is true. That someone asked a father or mother, which child is your favorite? And then they went through all the vulnerabilities of the children as a means of how much love and the parent, put around them. And so it was kind of like a thing that you couldn't really define, but that you had like, well, this child I'm protective of and longing for this for them, And so from a conscientious position, I see people having a protective thing about beliefs and behavioral checkboxes, in a sense, being very protective of that because they can see if you're not doing this where it leads, which is accurate. But if you solely go that way too far, you neglect the actual relationship of what it's like to be someone outside of doing these things within the checkboxes because you haven't been brought to a point of that kind of understanding yet. And you may never, and that's fine. But again, the relationship part of it is so much harder to define because it, by its nature, is not something of definition. And for me, when I start to try and describe how I can join you at this point in belief of a similar thing, I have to kind of take this fact the way, so you all at home can't see this, but like if the circles are facts and the lines are the relationship, right? So you could imagine a whole grid of circles laid out, and there's lines in between each one of those circles. The lines represent the connectivity, and if you were to put them in a timeline, every fact that we have at some point in time became a fact, and there was a point in time when that thing was not a fact. Now, God, timeless, and has always been. God, not a fact, or just in our thinking and our belief system, we don't know what was beyond that, and we don't know about God before he was dating our mother or whatever, you know. So there's this, as I focus my telescope, right, to like, what is God? I got to look back that way. Then I have to look that way in the direction of how I believe, or I can make sense of how that turned into this, either philosophically or within reality. And as I look forward, I look in the same manner of, like, if I'm looking forward, I look at how facts could potentially relate and come together to make more facts moving forward. But as I look backwards, I have to break them apart and say, all right, this fact consists of these sub-facts that come together consistently every time to produce this fact. So if we have like 10 separate facts that create this one reliable fact, the 10 connections are the relationship that make that fact. So as I look back towards God, I have to continually break everything down until we get to truth and love. Now, the lines or the relationship in each one of those kind of equations that make the facts are the subjective state, the interaction between two things, the process of being in relationship. And that aspect of it is where I exist and find the stepping stones of facts for me, rather than at the end of all that subjective journey, the objectified results being something that you can put in a checkbox that someone who's more conscientious can then say, these we will do. It's a very, very different way of existing, but it's for where I'm at, I have to be able to have some way of looking at it and thinking about it that pulls from my experience for me to be able to accept it as true. And it's in understanding the consistent patterns of my life that I can see the different nature of things that as a pattern overlay the truth of the Bible. And this is where I've more so become a deist, in that I see a completely, over time, essentially disconnected series of books that outline the trajectory of everything if you look at it in this light of truth and love, or truth and relationship, right? And that that ability to break things down like that gives me the confidence to say, I see the pattern in my life, and I can identify that same pattern that I can pull from my experience. I see it in the Bible as well. And I see it over thousands of years. There's no way for these people to communicate between each other and to see that pattern arise so clearly to me, which I can, at some later date, actually go into, which is probably going to be pretty hard to make it through. But that indefinable thing of relationship is valued in the idea of free will, I think, because the easiest thing to do is to hammer down on the conscientious do's and don'ts and become more mechanical in achieving the end results. But it won't get you further than that. That's it. And it's going outside of those boundaries with great care that you start to see what's still potential. And that's a hard sell. It's a dangerous sell. But every single relationship, if it's a real and good relationship, also has the ability to end. It has the ability to be dangerous, to be it is, if you and your wife's relationship were not a relationship, it would be certain. And you have a relationship of trust with your wife to say that you're not chained up in the basement. I don't know that you'll be here when I get back, but I, in a sense, know that you will because of our trust over a lifetime of being married, and that that amount of truth within that experience is reliable, and to me, that's that indefinable thing of relationship. It's so much harder to describe, but it's the thing that you have to engage in to really encompass the full meaning of what it means to believe in God and strive and to connect. In the way that I can feel that, have a harder time articulating it, but in the way that I exist in and can feel that, I would imagine someone who's far more conscientious, of a opposite, in a sense, disposition than relationship, in more so conscientious, probably has a hard time of understanding the value of it as much as those who are open. So when I come to a situation where I'm not comfortable being open, now that's when I'm spending money to a person or group of people doing something for me, like building a barn. I want a highly, highly conscientious relationship. Massively. I want everything. I want to know exactly how it's going to be. So I know the exact end result, and I know exactly what I'm going to pay. Because this is my trauma point, like growing up, hearing my parents always talk about how far behind they were on money and everything else.
Yeah.
So in that sense, when it comes to money, I mean, I had the reputation of being an extremely mingy, mean and cheap person.
Yeah.
And because my ability to relate and to wander and to be free is supplied by resources.
Yeah.
That allow me to not have to exist within time boundaries and everything else as much. So I have this relationship where I utilize conscientious behavior for my trauma areas, if you will, right? So I tried to make as good a conscientious contract and everything with the person that built our barn. And I'm not good at those kind of relationships at all. Amber had to take over. Not a single thing signed, nothing like that done, fully open.
Yeah. That's
open
so
and managed the whole thing beautifully in an open manner. No signed things, no nothing. Now, a highly conscientious person like my wife dealt with this thing in extraordinary fashion in a completely open manner because she feels full confidence in that area. She doesn't have a strong emotional tie to funds. Come and go. And in that relationship, she knows how to endear herself to people and they'll want to make her happy in that sense. So to me, it's a very interesting thing to see.
Very fascinating.
Like, oh, okay, where I'm uncomfortable, because of my nature, where I'm uncomfortable, I'll rely on, it's kind of like my fear pushes me towards conscientious behavior. Now, I wonder if someone who's conscientious, when they're fearful, do they resort to open behavior in a situation? Or I don't know how to...
Yeah.
That's out of my... I know now what it feels like being open, being around a lot of highly conscientious people, and how that can feel like you're in a very judgmental and rigid situation. And it's not to say that that situation is wrong. It's maybe an exaggeration or a... just farther on the gradient of the kind of, not society, but just feel of a group that people are comfortable with. People that are like that are more comfortable in that. But I do think that we have to, have these things together and working together because the safety is in the tension between the two. But yeah, to be able to identify where I use conscientious and open interactions, where I feel talented and capable, I'm comfortable being open. Where I feel more fearful, I use conscientious behavior to to where I feel like I'm not talented. I use conscientious behavior to say, all right, here's how other people have figured out how this goes smoothly. I'll use that. And I think that's really appropriate, honestly. Like, I don't have a lot of talent in managing people. So why not use the script that other people have used to make sure that this doesn't all go wrong? But even in that, I couldn't do it successfully.
I think that's you've put your finger on a very insightful point, because there's probably a sense in which we're all conscientious on some level.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so what are those points? And does that give insight into our own trauma, if you will? So I'm thinking about my own, and like you kind of alluded to with the touch points of gender and whatever, I guess there's probably something there in my own life where I covet and crave the acceptance of people. And so the people that I covet and crave their acceptance right now are of a certain demographic, mindset, whatever. So I want to be careful. And so that just gives me insight into how I relate to people in my religious community who don't seem to get it, right? Like, they're so disconnected from the types of people that I want to be accepted by.
That's a good way of putting that.
Frustrates me so I'm a part of this group over here where the majority of the people are speaking in ways that are alienating to this group. And I covet the acceptance of this group. But if this group knows that I'm a part of this group, then I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
That's insightful. Thank you for helping me with that.
Yeah. One of the reasons I left Adventism is because I knew it was beneficial to me while excluding others.
I remember you saying that before.
So, yeah, is that just biting your nose to spite your face kind of thing, if I'm saying that right?
Yeah.
But to me, at some point, it at least tells me that this is not the appropriate medical procedure for the experience of being human, right? Like, if it's helping me but not others, they're being rejected and run off, like they are. They're still human. They still struggle with pain and the idea of being accepted, and here I am, like, well, I got my in-group, and as long as I say the right words and dress the right way, and I'll be fine, and I will benefit from feeling accepted. And to me, that felt disingenuous to partake of that while knowing others were not welcome.
I mean, there's always going to be a sense in which every group, no group can benefit everybody.
This
right?
is why I'm not a part of any group.
You're part of this group right now.
I am a part of any group that's willing to, like, talk and answer questions that could be offensive. That's my jam.
That's those are your people.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm with you. So anyway, I know it's interesting because I was listening to a podcast recently where they were interviewing a guy who left Adventism, who started his own church.
Oh, I've been thinking about doing this. It's a great tax write-off.
There you go. So he's like Adventist adjacent.
Oh, I gotta talk to this
but
guy.
he's in California,
of course,
and he's super progressive.
Yeah.
And the guys who are interviewing him, who are on the progressive end of Adventism, but still in Adventism, they were kind of pushing back a little bit and just kind of trying to get a sense for like what they would do at this guy's church if somebody came and spoke on some conservative, conscientious idea.
When everyone stamped their feet and was going to run them off.
Yeah, and he's like, well, it's impossible to be fully accepting of all people and all behaviors. He's like, every
going
group,
full circle.
Every group has its boundaries, and
I don't like that.
You don't like that?
It's wrong. But that's my nature.
So,
like,
but
I don't like boundaries.
Isn't there an appropriate, again, boundaries at their best?
I mean, I agree with you, but I don't like it.
Yeah. But boundaries at their best so boundaries instead of walls.
I mean,
Boundaries.
just love. That's what
Yeah,
it is.
yeah.
Love objectified is law. But laws are boundaries. Boundaries are
So that
essentially
for
you
this-
need to, if I allow you to cross this boundary,
It's
you will be degrading me to a point
Yes.
that I need to stand up for myself. So it's like you're setting a law
yeah.
to say that you can break that law once, twice, 3 times, maybe, and maybe I'll forgive you 77 times 7 or whatever.
Yep.
Or, this is a boundary that I've had too many people cross that boundary, and I'm not a person who can handle this, so that's my law or my boundary. And same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, so I think that's what it's supposed to be, right? It's just that these are behaviors that are unhealthy for people in the group or other people. So that's what a boundary is supposed to be. And I'm fine with that. Where it gets tricky is for me, and I'm working through this myself, is if you boast of your inclusivity, but then you still have boundaries,
Yeah.
are you
hypocritical.
being hypocritical?
Yeah.
And I don't know, because I don't know.
In a sense, it's hypocritical, but it's hypocritical to not admit that they are a reality, and everyone, you have to accept that everyone has their different boundaries. And you can make a judgment through interacting with people, and I don't think making judgments are bad. I know it has a bad rap recently, but you have to make judgments on people. I mean, you will meet people in Portland that you will say, you should come over to our house for dinner. There will be others. And you will make a judgment, and you'll say, you'd like to come to our church.
Yeah.
We will not be inviting you. Yeah. There's certain people that have gone through a little too much trauma too recently that you need to protect those that are under your protection from to a degree. Been to the prison. I've seen it. It's
So if we're framing it in that way, I think that's good. And as long as we're clear on that, what happens is the boundaries that are protected in conscientious religious communities are framed as somehow detracting from God's well-being in many ways. Would that be safe to say? Would that be correct to say?
Okay,
So,
now, how was I thinking about that before you said it? I was thinking approval from God. But now you're saying beneficial or what?
detract from his well-being. or something.
Well-being.
I mean,
right.
yeah.
I'd never thought of God in that way, that I'm going to degrade God's experience by my behavior. I thought of it in more so a sense that I might not get the jackpot at the end.
Well, remember though the idea we've thrown out there about justifying God. Like my bad behavior makes God look bad, right?
If you're taking the name of God in vain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which there's a certain level that there's truth to that, right? To some degree.
I would agree that the perfect interaction of truth and love, if I'm to say I'm taking the name of God on me, to say that I'm trying to work in both truth and love, I'll take that name. And if I preach that and obviously don't do that, then I'm besmirching at least what I called an interaction of truth and love. And if someone looks up to me for saying you are trying to do something and you've set ideological touch points, but you're not doing it to that degree, you either have enough influence to mislead these people or you just lose their relationship because they realize you're not a consistent person, or the light that you've been given has not penetrated deep enough into your person to make you trustworthy enough to be interactionable with them.
And I would say that there's a certain truth to that concern, that my behaviors do reflect on God for good or bad.
At least your idea of what you should be doing from your idea of God.
So
right?
where I think part of where I get uncomfortable and could be a problem is a lot of times the people who, in my experience, who talk about that the most, the behaviors,
the behaviorists
that they police are not behaviors of much consequence, in my understanding. So where I think of it in a correct manner is what type of person am I relationally? Am I a person of integrity, of patience, of love, of justice, of mercy? Where so often I run into it with the circles that you and I encounter is the behaviors that are emphasized as as making God look bad are, am I wearing a dress that's too short? Am I eating the wrong food? Am I listening to the wrong music?
Yeah.
So those are the things that are proposed as making God look bad, but then they can be sorry for being judgmental, but they can be extremely impatient, unkind, dysfunctional relationally.
Yeah,
You're like,
on
oh, that
the-
doesn't matter.
On the spectrum, it can go too far, and then you can get. Yeah, we had an experience where we were part of a group of people that gathered once a week that started to break apart, and they had like a mediator come. And the only question I remember is like, so what do you guys think the difference between conservatives and liberals or something like that was the question. And this very conservative, conscientious guy stood up and said, well, the conscientious are those who do the will of God, and the liberals are those who don't. And he sat down, and that was it. And, this person, later found themselves without a family.
Yeah.
Because of specifically their behavior in the family. And, and there's a degree to what you were saying earlier, these trappings of conscientious to open. And the thing I do find is that the intention of the character of those who are conscientious is to do what's right. And I don't fault them for that. They are trying to the best of their ability to do what they feel called to do. The problem is that if you're not of that same disposition, to be in relation to them can feel like a constant and very judgmental experience. So the people that are outside of those behavioral patterns, when they come into your sphere of influence and start to observe you in that sense, at least from maybe a churched perspective, like not like full-on drug user living on the streets, but like just, going from one church to another. And then all of a sudden you feel like, whoa, you guys are really, really hardcore about these little things. And it can start to feel like, a deep repulsion of not good enough, not good enough, not good enough, not good enough, not good enough. Now, if you come from the gutter and you go to that and you say, wow, you guys are on track here and you've got it together and you're doing, that can pull that type of person in.
It often does.
Yeah, and maybe rightly so. In some instances, I don't know. I do know that they are 50% of the population, just as much as we have a disposition of male and female born as. In the same way, we have conscientious and open, and it's life experience that helps us adopt the other side. And I think it's love that, like romantic love, that mostly helps us adopt the disposition of the other side, because you're typically attracted to your opposite. In some sense, right? And for me, by learning about those who are far more conscientious through marriage, I've come to love and appreciate someone who has
religiously
a very
conscientious. Because you said financially.
Oh, well.
And relationally.
She's still very, very financially conscientious as far as like debt and everything, the Dave Ramsey train and all that.
Oh, yeah. Anyway, sorry to break your train of thought.
So there's that ability to, it attracts you and then repels you. And then you come to that pain point of, all right, is this about me and my comfort? Or is this about me truly understanding you and your difficulties and how we can relate together and not being concerned about myself, but working this out? And there's something in that moment where the desire for comfort and self burns off, and you allow for being committed to your choice. And to when that burns off, you somehow admit to yourself that you're true to your word rather than true to what you want. And it's in that moment where that burns off and you can somehow fall that much more deeply in love and appreciate that person and know more about that person much more deeply. And it's in that moment where you start to learn about the other side much more so and be able to appreciate them. It still doesn't make everyone else that you're not married to not difficult. So it's very interesting to see how the conscientious, the open, and the relationship, the conscientious are not as relationally oriented in a sense, but like my wife is. She's highly,
She's
this
an
is so
enigma.
confusing to, I mean, talking about relationship is just in its nature, like it's easier to talk about facts, to talk about truth than it is relationship, because you're talking about, for me, for sure. I guess I'm talking about the thing that I find myself more a part of in a sense. So it just seems harder to find. But I find that true both through the masculine and feminine as well. The masculine aims to be defined and useful at a single purpose in a sense to then be able to protect and provide, where the feminine classically is more so relationally oriented to be able to meet in a sense, a larger degree of needs and to be a conduit for the most central and important thing of it all, that family.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I would say that, going back to the religiously conscientious, I know somebody who is extremely conscientious. I know a lot of people who are like that, but
you're
I'm thinking,
Adventist, you know a lot.
I know a lot. And I've lived in this.
And they're good people.
They're good people. They're great people.
Some of my favorite people are
Yes,
conscientious.
absolutely. But this individual describes everybody else as landmines. Like, so they are extremely detached from any relational expression of religion and life, just because
Every relationship is a landmine, potentially.
in some ways, but that's okay, because those of us who have not experienced the degree of trauma that this person seemingly has have discovered that more people are, at least in our lives, are safer than not safe in some level.
So they're discovering that more people are safer.
No, I'm saying the rest of us, like those of us who've had maybe a little bit more healthy upbringing.
I find that to be true. The more people I run into, the more good people I think are out there.
Yeah. So this person, though, presumably, I'm projecting a little bit, but I think I know enough to say with some confidence, for in their experience, those that they were closest to growing up, those landmines blew up and it was painful.
Yeah.
And so the assumption is that everybody else is a landmine that's going to blow up if you touch them. And so it's easier to just remove themselves from those landmines. So
I do
there's
that to a degree.
a lot of comfort. I'm sure we all do that, right? So there's a lot of comfort. I mean, I do it with conscientious people now more and more, right? Because like I've experienced enough pain from the conscientious people that I'm like, I gotta avoid those people.
It's a little much.
Yeah. So there's a lot more safety in the rules, like in truth, than in people. So it's you feel less threatened by, because listen, an objective truth can't hurt you. A person can. So and like what to expect with objective truth or rules, whatever. Like you just know you do this and this is going to happen. Whereas with people, because people are so dynamic and unpredictable, like we try to avoid it because we feel very threatened when we don't know what to expect, right? So I think the reason I bring this up is because I think people who've experienced a lot of trauma, and I would say a lot of conscientious people have experienced a lot of religious trauma. There's so much more safety, because when we experience that trauma, that feeling. There was a psychiatrist named Basil van der Kolk who's written a book called The Body Keeps the Score.
Boy, that's a serious name.
And yes, it is. It's a very, very impressive name. He's a MD down in Harvard or something like that, or Massachusetts, and he wrote a book, a very, very seminal,
What's seminal mean?
like seminal means like course setting in some ways. Like this was a breakthrough work
Okay.
that set the course for.
Do you know what penultimate means?
Penultimate is like the second to the last.
Yeah. So many people think it's like the apex.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that. Friend of mine, his neighbor did a whole video on this, like some gobzillion $1 million yacht. And he's like narrating it. It's the penultimate. And the friend was like, didn't even tell him. He was like, should I tell him? I don't know.
It's so awkward and hard. No. So this work, the body keeps the score. There's been a lot of discussion about it, and in some ways, it was very significant in bringing the idea of trauma into more popular consciousness. Where, like, admittedly, some people push back because the word trauma has become almost vacuous because it's used so much, you know.
Yeah.
But I think there's something to be said there.
Sure.
I think it's better to talk too much about trauma than not enough about trauma. But anyway, so he's talking about how he talks about how our bodies, like scientifically, medically, there's now insight into how our bodies carry trauma around. And it has all sorts of repercussions. Like
right here.
There you go. Like, you know, higher rates of not only depression, but heart disease and cancers and so forth, the more trauma you experience. And there's something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test. And you can do a little survey test, very simple. You click, like, when I was a child, I, was food deprived, or like my parents were absent, et cetera. You can go down this list, and the higher score you have, the more likely certain outcomes are to happen, like physically in your life. So like morbidly obese, or again, higher rates of cancer, whatever. Which, by the way, side note, Seventh-day Adventists, we have a huge emphasis on, quote unquote, the health message.
The backhand of the gospel.
The right arm of the gospel.
Backhand of the gospel.
But what we don't talk about a lot of times is mental and emotional health. And I think this is a missing link, is the reality of trauma and how it affects our bodies.
That conversation goes right to meditation sometimes. So that's a difficult one in Adventist circles.
Also a hot button. Yeah. So the point is that our bodies carry around this trauma. And we have experienced so much of that trauma sometimes that we want to eliminate the feelings of threat.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I carry it in my body. The more and more and more threatened I feel, the more my body gets to an unhealthy place. So we therefore try to put ourselves in position to minimize possible threats, which is, again, that's understandable. But again, the more trauma we feel and experience, the more we want to avoid any potential threat. And so religiously, I think what goes on is we have communities who gravitate towards one another in many ways, who they have experienced religious trauma, and they are gathering around a common experience that helps them minimize the feeling of threat, right? And so, relationship feels threatening. So we're focused on those religious values that make us minimize those threats. Now, inevitably, what happens is, even though there's communities that are conscientious and are trying to gather around those core values of what we would probably call conservative or traditional values, since those people are so relationally unhealthy, even those core values can't long-term sustain that community because people will start being unhealthy towards each other and
Yeah,
break apart.
if you're coming from a place of trauma, a conscientious playbook is far safer than well, relate to it. You know. So how do you handle that in where you're focusing, where you're going to be ministering? Because you're essentially going to be reaching out to an underserved population of alternative lifestyle, drug addicted, homeless, potential, the whole gamut, essentially, that like, you know, like the people that, I don't know, Christ would hang out with, right?
Yeah.
So how do you approach that while knowing that there are specific conscientious behaviors that are beneficial, but you have like this history of like, you know, like,
It feels too suffocating.
well, I don't want to bring all this conscientious stuff into what I'm trying to do to protect you guys from what I know it can turn into.
Well,
that'll make you feel like you're being run off.
I think again, a lot of the conscientious stuff is fine, but it's just a lot of it is determined by how you present it.
Is subtext to the right thing? Like it's notes or subtext rather than body?
That's part of it. You have to lead with love. You have to lead with relationship, communicating that there's a long leash. And again, just because you are prioritizing relationship, it doesn't mean that there's no boundaries. It's just being healthy enough to allow people to cross those boundaries more often than if I was unhealthy. Right. And so, and being able to articulate those boundaries in ways that are healthy, not in ways that make it sound like your acceptance with God is determined by your ability to not cross those boundaries or, you know, et cetera. So again, it's a lot of it is just all comes in framing, right? Like, so just use a very simple, probably example that we could agree with, like an emphasis on healthy, I don't know, eating maybe, or like the idea that you don't want to pump yourself full of heroin is probably a very easy.
No one's going to really disagree with
with that.
much.
Yeah. So let's just take that as an example. If I go to a group of heroin addicts, right? Like I could come in and the first thing I lead with is you need to like get rid of your heroin. And if you don't, like you're going to hell. That's a very extreme example. Or I could lead with love and prioritize relationship. And over time, what the heroin addict really is longing for is connection.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in the addiction community understand or have said that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. So
yeah, I've heard that. Yeah.
So yeah, at the core of human existence, again, is this desire for connection. And when I don't have that, when I don't have healthy connections, I'm going to use different means to feel good about myself.
No, I can see that.
So that long-term connection. Now that doesn't mean you don't have boundaries, right? When you're looking at connections, but again, it's being clear on why those boundaries are being set.
Yeah, in relationship, if you're, that's the thing. Like relationship is so hard to define, but if you if I think of the difference between facts and truth is relationship, and facts is truth is relationship. Facts are, I guess, truth would be a process of being open, is what I would say, and facts are a process of being conscientious. In a sense where I can say, if I'm conscientious, we've taken love, we've objectified it, we've created a law. We've taken subjective experience and we've realized that there's a fact here. Focusing on the fact is the emotional draw for those who are conscientious. Focusing on the things that created the fact, or the process by which is more the focus of those who are open. So you get one group of people who are more so focused at the process of coming to finding facts rather than praising and worshiping the facts. They're more so towards praising and worshiping the process of finding the facts. And then the conscientious are more emotionally comfortable with maintaining, protecting, preserving, and reminding people of the facts. Now, we get the facts wrong. This is why it's so difficult for those who are open to present new facts to a group that already has all the facts. And they say, we got all the facts. We don't need any more facts. And by presenting this fact, you're undermining our other facts.
We've figured it all out.
Yeah. That's a interesting thing to consider when I come to understanding relationship. Okay, so the importance of relationship is to understand the why, in a sense, to me, to engage with the questions, to engage with the, to some degree challenging. And that's why relationships can be difficult. They're always going to be challenging to some degree because you have different perspectives trying to clarify a picture together. There's always going to be relative positions there. So when I come to interacting with a relationship or thinking of the nature of relationship, I have to understand it as a far more subjective thing meant for a purpose rather than a purpose that's already been codified or solidified, turned into a fact, and if you will. So in my interaction with other humans, to consider on our level, all right, I'm going to be relating to you. I just have to consider that you got to listen more than tell, and the best way to change someone is to love and accept them. But then when I come to the idea of God and belief, how do I use relationship? I use relationship to explore, to challenge, to question, and that is the respect of free will in that sense. To that ability to relate is in a sense an ability to judge a fact. So that ability to relate is my ability to question the existence of God, which is encapsulated in the creation story and the fact that God created. And that, okay, here you go. I've taken my character and bifurcated it into now this existence, and let's see where it goes. We get to justify the character of God. I can see it that way. I can see relationship working that way. I can see that it's my responsibility to actually wrestle with these facts and to change some of them with courage, not confidence, overconfidence, not determination, not zealousness, or any of that, but with respect and with great concern and trepidation. You have to engage with reassessing the boundaries, reassessing the facts every generation. It's just how it is. And that's how we progress. That's why there's a pushback. That's why I had this epiphany when we were going over the green bridge that goes into Boston. Like, why is it so hard to get people to see what I'm seeing? And I realized, like, well, if everyone just gave up as soon as I came up with an idea, they'd accept a lot of bad ideas. It's up to me to have to, like, work through an idea, pitch it, and then the conscientious are going to be like, look at these. These are established, and you didn't make a good case for undermining these.
Yeah.
So I have to do my work really, really well, and I have to respect the disposition that they have, not just their position, but their general disposition of being of value. To say that you are conscientious, you have more of a tie to these things. I don't. I'll dismiss them very quickly and go try that knowledge of good and evil. Just no problem. But they won't. There'll be more, Adam doing exactly what he was supposed to do while Eve wandered off, So
what intrigues me, kind of dovetailing off what you're expressing here, maybe this is going a little farther afield, but what's fascinating to me is that maybe you could say all, not just almost, but all new religious groups start out as
highly open,
by definition, progressive, open.
As the Adventists did.
As Adventism. But almost 100% of the time, those groups then solidify and stultify and set in their beliefs, values in cement, and they then become traditional and conservative. I don't know if that's inevitable, good, bad, indifferent, but it's just fascinating to me. And Adventism, the same way, absolutely, 100%. Mid-19th century, new, progressive, open, pushing back against established, quote unquote, established traditions, and like really forward thinking. And I don't know what to do with that. I don't know, like there are some people who then appeal to the progressive nature of early Adventism and say, see, we need to be like that still. Or is that too chaotic to sustain itself long term? There is something to be said for institution building that allows
I hate, but I do value.
But it allows for long-term sustainability.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, let us take a group of people that we are not emotionally identifying with, the Mormons.
Yeah.
They started out pretty wild, kind of out there, and rejected by a lot of society. And I can imagine that as they were moving west, because everyone was like, get out of here, and they had these crazy, like, look in the hat, read the thing, the gold tab, all the things, which you can level at Adventism too, in my opinion. Sure. And you can imagine them coming over a hill and seeing a big old lake and be like, this is it. And this happened, it's like, this is it. And then they get down there and it's like, oh, it's a salt lake.
Wah, wah.
But it's still, it's funny. The whole Salt Lake City is nowhere on that Salt Lake. That thing stinks and there's flies and beautiful area. But Mormonism over time has refined and become a very different thing than it originally was. They don't practice the multiple wives except in their like caribou sense.
Fundamentals.
Communities. So, there's this refine that took a while to germinate there, Shawn.
Hopefully nobody caught that, but anyway, go ahead.
I kid. You guys have to have a sense of humor.
But most people, here. I don't know how many people watch this. Or
there's going to be 5 people.
There's 5 people. I don't know how many of the 5 will understand what you're saying.
So there's this refinement over time of like maybe at the progressive beginning, there's got to be far more juicy bits to get people in. It's like hat, gold thing, I'm in, but then there's like these good ideological points and it does create a community. And now look at them. They're genuinely, I don't know how correct their theology is, but their lifestyle and their community arguably improves a lot of lives.
Yeah.
You can't argue with that.
Man.
Now, they came from some weird stuff. I'm being nice.
But they're coming to your door soon, right? Remember? Because they're going to convert you. You're like almost a Mormon, Trent.
I'm nowhere close. But that I see the need for humans to have a group and a process by which they live, and in some sense a checklist of do's and don'ts.
Yeah,
and their checklist and all that is a really good crutch, in my opinion, which is very belittling. I get that for the millions of people that I just offended. I get it. But for some reason, I have this disposition where I do not want to be a part of a group because of how I relate. That it means that then I have to sign off my own thinking. I don't want to be in the Army. I don't want to be in the Navy. I don't want to be in any group. I want to be one-on-one.
We need to go back. Sometime we need to explore why. I mean, there's something there, right?
Yeah. And I don't know if that's a trauma thing.
Yeah.
Or,
As a child, I don't want to play, again, armchair psychologist here, but when you were growing up, what was your group experience like in school? What you went to? Did you go to you went to a Seventh-day Adventist elementary school?
Yep.
How big?
Let's see. The first one I remember, Mount Vernon grade school there. And it was each classroom probably had 20 to 30 kids. I mean, definitely the size of Pine Tree if the whole thing was a grade school.
Okay. Were you like a part of groups?
I've always just had like a tighter, smaller group of friends.
Okay.
It's always been that way for me. And I imagine if it's the wrong person, they felt like I was probably a little clingy or I don't know. There's a large degree of my social disposition is that, well, I don't want to burden people with this. Because it's I mean, just this is my normal, like what's going on in my head. And this is going to be hard for anyone to sit through. Why am I going to put like, I know you have some interest in this area. So I was like, I got to get Shawn to do this. He'd maybe be able to handle it. I get that. And I couldn't have told you that when I was a kid, but I just never.
So let me ask you a question. Do you care if 5 people watch this or 5 million people? Would you be like, yay, 5 million people are watching?
Oh yeah, of course. Like I'm not clean of wanting other people to see what I see and acknowledge that I've found some kind of truth. In my issue might be arrogance that I want to find it, not someone else. That's very much a potential. But I know that the best way I can know something is to experience it. And if I'm accepting things through a group, it's not as much my unique experience that's gotten me there. Now, the way I can articulate this that I have found in common with someone else who's as weird as me, my friend Carl Ramsdell, let's see, I took one guitar lesson, and after I took it, I realized like that was good, but if I keep doing this, I'm going to be producing what someone else wants me to produce rather than I find my voice through this. And that was very important to me to not do that. Even in 8th grade, that's when I took that lesson and I knew like, no, I want to do this on my own. And I know I may never be as good and I may never, but the truth I find in it will be much clearer to me. And in the same way, my friend Carl has become a well-known nature photographer that takes incredible photos, doesn't know how to operate a camera. He puts it on A. And that's it. That's it.
But
and
he's become accomplished at this?
Very. Like he makes his living off of it. He's like probably up to 30,000 followers on Instagram just in the last couple years.
How would I find Carl?
Oh, danger. I think Carl Ramsdell.
With a C or a K?
K. And again,
I'm doing some fact checking to see if he's accomplished.
Morally,
he has a blue check.
Oh yeah, he's blue checked.
Okay.
Morally, he is nowhere near on the same path as me, but he is my friend.
And you've outed him that he just does the A.
Oh, he'll tell you that. He doesn't know anything about photography other than being able to make amazing images.
Yeah,
And
that's funny. I mean, just dovetailing off that, like, I'm not a gearhead either. Like people, hey, because I'm not Trent Bell photographer, but I feel like I take a few decent pictures. But people are like, so what's the latest? What's the latest camera I should buy? I'm like, I have no idea. I'm the wrong person to ask. But anyway.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up because this is a relationship camera.
Okay.
Not a truth camera.
Tell me about that.
So that's a good way of thinking about this. So you see the screen on the back of this digital camera?
Yeah.
That's all you get. You don't get to see what you shot.
Oh.
So they call it chimping when you take a picture and you look at it constantly, take another one, look at it, take another one. If I really want to, I can pull this down and there's a screen down there and I can see it. But the best camera like this to get the same setup, you'll be like 16 grand and there'll be no screen on the back on the most expensive one. And you don't get to see the images until you go put them in the computer and,
Got you. This
so
is like a
Sony-
dumb phone. This is like going
yes,
back.
to a degree.
Well, it's like trying to get away from a smartphone, but in a camera because
Right. So
like,
let's think of this
it's a regression.
relationally.
Yeah.
The turd that I just gave to Tim to sell is this Sony.
But buy it, please, at a high price.
If you want a technical, factual, incredibly camera, get a Sony. It'll feel like crap in your hands. It's just, ugh. And the colors that come out of it, to me, just after using Fuji, it's not that great. The files are higher quality. The reliability is better. The Sony is a highly conscientious, technical, factual camera, 100%. But I don't want to have it in my hands because it doesn't look good. It doesn't feel good to use. Technically, it's a far better camera. If I can get past that part, the end results are better with that camera technically. But I'll create better images that will be more moving with this camera because of my experience of interacting with it. And this sounds like woo-woo, soft boy, soy boy, whatever. But the fact that this thing limits my experience of too much technical back and forth checking and tells me to be present in the moment is more relational. And like when you look through the eyepiece, you're not seeing what the camera's actually seeing. You're seeing what's coming through there. Now this camera, you can switch that out and actually see through there, which is kind of fun. But this is far more about the user experience in what you can accomplish in being more submersed in the subjective experience of you actually want to have this camera with you, for one, just because it looks
But
cool.
you haven't used this camera.
Just got it last night. No. But I've had others like it that I used long enough to get to know and got bored of and switched it out. And I'll do that with this one too. I know that about myself now. I will not have this probably more than 2 years. I'll grow tired of it and I'll want to get that really absurdly expensive one. But then what'll I do if I have the best one? I had that experience when I went to Indonesia. I thought I wouldn't want to live here because it's the best place on earth. And then I won't have that to go to. It's a weird thing. But yeah, so this is a subjective camera, but when I work, I want a camera that's more technical because I'm wanting to accomplish a very specific goal.
Oh, so this is not for work.
No. This is so I'm better at work.
Okay.
So it's a weird thing where you're looking for subjective quality rather than technical results. Now apply that to concept of God, concept of community, concept of church, and how you interact with people. The results, you might have more teen pregnancies and bad health, things with this. Yeah. But maybe a more vibrant and healthy community long term with, maybe more shameful results. Who knows? Yeah. But also you won't be running people off for lack of, this image is not there. I can see noise in this image, or So it's
by the way, your friend Carl has 56,000 followers.
Good grief, he had 30 the other day.
Well, he's got some good pictures.
Oh, he goes out and he sleeps on some of the islands overnight, and
I have a number of my friends who follow him.
Oh, he's well known.
Wow. And I know you and you know him, so we're just 2 degrees separated.
I've had him in here to talk. He's wow. He's a really, you could do a documentary on him if you looked at the overall trajectory of his life.
Really? Well, I'd be fascinated to hear that.
Oh my, would you?
The point is, we were psychoanalyzing you.
Okay, back to psychoanalysis.
Why you don't like groups? But we don't. I know we could go all day on this stuff.
Yeah, and we are approaching close to 3 hours potentially, but
two, I think.
2. Okay.
Well, anyway, yeah.
To kind of wrap it up, I mean, relationship is the subjective part of our existence. It is the subjective part of everything outside of our existence. There is relationship between molecules, chemicals, neutrons, whatever. Everything relates.
What's the objective part of our existence? Just to clarify, because
our
I
bodies,
think by definition we are. only ever subjective. But
Well, I mean, there's the factual objective, like that's objective. You're there, but your interacting and your emotional state is the subjective cross where everything interacts.
what do you mean is an objective state is the way somebody is encountered from the outside of them. So I'm an object to you, right? You're an object to me, is what you're saying.
In a sense, like if I were a more conscientious person, I'd be focused on the objective checklists, in a sense, for the human body. I'd be a little more concerned about clothing it properly, putting the right things in it, going to the right places at the right time, not doing the wrong things at the wrong. So kind of what you do with the objective, it seems to be a little bit more of a focus than the experience of what it feels like in relationship. So,
well, what you're saying is there are objective rules that conscientious people say generally govern human beings.
yes, but
And
those rules came to us through subjective means.
Yeah, well, that's another discussion. But the point is that people who are conscientious believes that there are objective rules that govern human beings, and those objective rules need to be followed.
Right. My take on that would be that we made these up.
Yeah.
And now we didn't just make them up. We observed behavior over time and correctly assumed that like doing this is going to be a bad result long term. Let's make that a law or at least a cultural norm or, you know, a tradition or, you know.
Yeah.
So I find myself, I find my importance in the line between the dots. The dots are facts. Other people find the importance and their existence in standing their ground on the dots and protecting them. And I'm going between all the dots, kind of
Trying to figure it out.
yeah. And that's it's funny that this is the most wandering and potentially harder thing to follow because we're trying to talk around this thing that's so ambiguous, in a sense,
But
ethereal.
the 5 people who are listening and watching, they will.
Oddly, I heard from 2 people that actually made it through these conversations. One of them,
And one of them was not your wife.
I doubt she's listened to them. She can't take more of
I
me.
know
Go
that
on.
my wife has not listened to them.
Yeah, when you're a essentially a public figure, you can just kind of guarantee like we'll take firsthand what you think, Shawn, but we're not going to go listen to all this.
Yeah. We've heard it all.
We've heard it all.
So 2 people though have responded.
Well, interestingly, a design professional in Texas that got to know about me through her firm used me to shoot something out in DC. And then she went down a bit of a rabbit hole and ended up at this podcast somehow. I don't know how. But then listened to him. And she's from a Christian background, but is, a highly educated person, which starts to push you out of traditional church circles sometimes, not all the time. And she seemed to find it beneficial to have a more turning all the stones over kind of conversation around this type of thing, which can be very uncomfortable for some people, but very engaging and exciting for others. So
Cool.
yeah. So
Well, hello.
Yeah, hello. And the other person was she, and I feel bad because I can't remember anyone's name ever, hardly.
You just know cities.
Well, she was up at Camp Laurelwell this weekend, and she was a student at Pine Tree that was in my photo class that I put on there for Art Clinic, and she was working at camp. And she's like, oh, no, we met before, and it was at the Photoshop. And actually, I listened to the podcast that you and Shawn did. And I was like, oh, whoa, someone listened to it. So, yeah.
We have to be careful now about what we say.
There's no being careful in matters of God.
Just kidding.
We must be
Totally
honest.
kidding.
But yes, we must be
Totally
somewhat
kidding.
respectful, not offend people in some sense. But you can't do that either. So, so this has been do you have anything else to say about relationship before we go?
Not before we go.
So this should just confuse people more. because it's relationship. But how would you summarize it? Like if I were to have a more conscientious disposition, I would be focusing on more kind of like the things you can put your hands on that are practical and they're good, and and if I have a more open disposition, I'm involved more so in the process of coming to those things. But once I get to those things, like if I use this camera long enough, I'll just get bored of it, and because of my nature. So it's a weird thing to understand about yourself, but then to also use that to understand your ideas about God and how you believe. If you're more conscientious, you probably believe in a different process than someone who's more open. And so using relationship to pull your belief from, rather than facts to pull your thing from, is the major distinction for me there. To recognize and to understand that this is valid for some people to maybe a 60-40 split. Like they rely more so on proven facts and then a lesser amount their experience, where some people rely more so on their experience and then less on proven facts. So that's what I would take away from this, probably.
Well put.
Put well enough to probably wrap this up and get you back to work.
Cool.
All right. So we'll figure out what the next one is here, and you all take care. And cut.